I remember the evening very clearly, although at the time it didn't feel important enough to become a turning point. It was just a dinner invitation at my son Daniel's house, the kind of polite family evening that gets scheduled 2 weeks in advance, because everyone is busy and calendars have to be checked. They lived in a large house on the north side of Asheville, in one of those newer neighborhoods where every lawn is trimmed to the same height, and the mailboxes all look like they were ordered from the same catalog. I had been there many times before. I knew where they kept the extra napkins, which cabinet held the glasses, which step on the back porch made a small creaking sound if you stepped on the left side instead of the right. I brought a pie with me that evening. Apple. Daniel always liked apple pie, even when he was a boy. I remember standing on the porch holding that pie and noticing the porch light was already on, even though it wasn't fully dark yet. I rang the bell and waited, and I could hear voices inside, and laughter, and the sound of plates. Caroline opened the door, but she didn't open it all the way. She stepped outside and pulled the door gently closed behind her. That was the first small thing that felt unusual, though I couldn't have said why at the time. "Margaret," she said, smiling, but it was the kind of smile people use when they're about to explain something inconvenient. "I didn't realize Daniel invited you for tonight." I remember adjusting the pie dish in my hands and saying, "Yes, he called me on Sunday." He said 7 o'clock. She hesitated for just a second, then said, "Tonight is actually a small dinner with some of Daniel's colleagues. It's not really a family dinner. It might be a little uncomfortable." Uncomfortable. I stood there on the porch, holding that pie, and for a moment I thought she was going to say, "But of course, come in." Instead, she said something else. "You know," she continued gently, "at this stage, Daniel really needs to focus on building relationships that are important for his career and for our future. We're trying to move in a certain direction socially. I hope you understand." I remember the porch light was very bright, brighter than it needed to be. It made everything look a little too sharp, like a photograph with too much flash. Then she said the sentence I would think about many times later. "Honestly, Margaret, this is a time when older parents should start living a little more modestly and independently, so the younger family can grow properly." I don't remember feeling angry when she said that. I remember feeling something much quieter than anger. Something more like a door closing in a room I didn't realize I was still standing in. I nodded once and said, "I see." She looked relieved that I wasn't arguing. "I'll tell Daniel you stopped by," she said. "We'll plan a proper family dinner soon." I handed her the pie and said, "This is for the dinner tonight. Apple. He likes apple." "Yes," she said. "He does. Thank you." And then she closed the door. I stood on that porch for a few seconds after the door closed. Not because I was expecting it to open again, but because I think I was trying to understand what had just happened. And understanding sometimes takes a minute to catch up with reality. Some people mistake silence for permission. At the time, I think Caroline mistook my silence for agreement. I walked back to my car slowly. The neighborhood was very quiet, the kind of quiet that expensive neighborhoods often have, like noise itself is discouraged. As I put my keys into the ignition, I realized something that felt small, but wasn't. I had helped pay for that house. Not all of it, but enough that my name had appeared on more than one document over the years: support transfers, down payment assistance, emergency repairs, tuition checks so their money could go toward mortgage upgrades instead. At the time, I didn't think much of it. That's what parents do when they can help. At least, that's what I had always believed. But as I drove home that night, I started doing something I hadn't done in a very long time. I started adding numbers in my head. Rough numbers at first. Mortgage assistance. School tuition supplements. The car lease I had co-signed on, and then quietly taken over the payments for when Daniel's firm had a slow year. The landscaping contract Caroline said was important for maintaining property value. The business software subscriptions she said she needed for her consulting work, insurance premiums, vacation deposits that were always temporarily short. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I wasn't thinking about the dinner anymore. I was thinking about structure, not emotions, not respect. Structure. Who pays? Who signs? Who authorizes? Who is legally responsible? Who is assumed to continue? That night, I didn't turn on the television. I didn't call anyone. I made a cup of tea and sat at the small desk in the corner of my living room where I kept a file box. Inside that box were folders I hadn't opened in a long time. Bank statements, transfer confirmations, property tax receipts, insurance notices, copies of checks, authorization forms. I opened the file box and just looked at the folders for a while before taking anything out. I remember noticing how thick some of them were. That's when something started to feel wrong. Not emotionally wrong, procedurally wrong. There's a difference. I pulled out the bank transfer folder and started reading. Not quickly, slowly, month by month, year by year. I made a small list on a yellow legal pad as I went, writing down each recurring payment and each account it came from. Around midnight, I found something I didn't remember signing. It was an authorization form draft, not fully processed, but prepared. My name was typed in the account holder section, and there was a signature line with a version of my name written on it, close enough to pass, if someone wasn't looking carefully. But not quite my handwriting. I stared at that page for a long time. Not angry, not panicked. Just very, very awake. That was the moment I stopped thinking about the dinner and I started thinking about procedure. By the time I went to bed that night, I had made a decision that surprised even me in how calm it felt. I wasn't going to argue with anyone. I wasn't going to accuse anyone. I wasn't going to explain anything on a porch. I was going to go to the bank in the morning and ask a very simple question. Can you show me exactly what I am legally responsible for and what I am not? Because I have learned something about life that most people only learn after a problem appears. Conversations can be denied. Memories can be disputed. But paperwork leaves a trail. And trails can be followed. I decided that night that I was not going to react emotionally. I was going to proceed administratively. And those two things, I would later learn, lead to very different outcomes. I went to the bank the next morning, a little after 9. Not right when it opened, but early enough that it wasn't crowded yet. I've always believed that if you're going to ask serious questions, it's better to do it before the day gets noisy. The branch was quiet, just the soft sound of printers and low voices from behind the glass offices. A young man at the front desk asked how he could help me, and I told him I needed to review my accounts and authorization records with someone who could access the full history. He nodded and said, "You'll want to speak with Miss Linda Carter. She handles account compliance and authorizations." Compliance. That was exactly the word I wanted to hear. Linda was in her late 40s, maybe early 50s, with reading glasses on a chain and a desk that was very organized. Not decorative organized, procedural organized, stacks labeled, trays marked in and out. A small clock placed where she could see it, without turning her head. "I understand you want to review authorized users and recurring transfers," she said after I sat down. "Yes," I said. "And any authorization forms that have been submitted in my name in the last few years." She didn't ask why. People who work in compliance don't ask why first. They look first. She turned her monitor slightly, typed for a few moments, then opened a file and began scrolling slowly. "All right," she said, very calm. "Let's go through this step by step." She printed a report and placed it on the desk between us. "These are all outgoing recurring transfers from your primary and secondary accounts," she said. "Mortgage support transfer, vehicle lease payment, 2 insurance policies, education account transfers, property maintenance, and several business-related subscriptions. She paused and then added, "You also have 3 authorized users who have inquiry access, and 1 authorization request that was flagged and not processed." "That's the one I want to see," I said. She opened another file and printed a form. When she placed it in front of me, I recognized it immediately. It was the same document I had found in my file box the night before. Only this one had a bank stamp in the corner that said, "Review Hold." This authorization form would have allowed an additional credit facility to be opened using your investment account as collateral, Linda said. But the signature did not match the specimen signature we have on file, so it was flagged and held for in-person confirmation. I looked at the signature again. Close enough to pass in a hurry, not close enough to pass under review. "I did not sign this," I said. "I understand," she replied calmly. That's why it was not processed. There was no drama in her voice, just procedure. "What would have happened if it had been processed?" I asked. She folded her hands on the desk and answered very directly. "You would have been legally responsible for the credit line, regardless of who used the funds." I nodded slowly and looked back down at the paper. That's when the room went quiet. Not literally, I could still hear printers and phones, and someone laughing softly in another office. But inside my head, everything got very quiet and very clear. "I want to review all authorized users," I said. She nodded and pulled up another screen. "Currently, Daniel has inquiry access and transfer request ability on 1 account. Caroline has inquiry access and submitted authorization forms in the past, but does not currently have direct transfer ability without your approval. Submitted authorization forms in the past. I would like to remove all third-party access," I said. She looked at me carefully, not surprised, just making sure. "All access?" she asked. "All access," I said. "And I want all recurring transfers reviewed individually. I may not cancel all of them today, but I want each one listed and explained." She nodded once. "All right, we'll do this properly." Properly. I liked that word. As she began entering the changes, she reached into a drawer and took out a laminated sheet. "I'm required to read this to you," she said. "Anytime a client removes authorized users and cancels recurring external transfers above a certain threshold, we review the account protection clause." She placed the sheet between us and read in a clear, practiced voice. "Account holders maintain full discretionary control over all transfers and authorized access. Third-party reliance on discretionary transfers does not constitute financial obligation. Termination of discretionary transfers does not require third-party consent." She looked up at me after she finished reading. "It's a standard policy," she said. "But I want to make sure you understand what it means." I nodded, slowly. "It means that just because I've been paying for something for a long time doesn't mean I'm required to keep paying for it." "That's correct," she said. I sat back in the chair for a moment and let that sentence settle in my mind. Just because you've been paying for something doesn't mean you owe it forever. Linda turned the monitor slightly so I could see the screen. "I'm going to walk through each authorized user and each recurring transfer," she said. "For each one, I need a clear instruction. Keep, modify, or terminate." We went line by line. Mortgage support terminate. Vehicle lease terminate. Private school tuition supplement terminate. Insurance premiums terminate. Business software subscription terminate. Property maintenance contract terminate. She didn't react. She didn't judge. She just clicked the appropriate boxes and moved to the next line. About halfway through, she paused and said, "There's also a credit line attached to your investment account. An inquiry was started, but not completed. I recommend we lock that facility and require in-person authorization only." "Yes," I said. "Lock it." She clicked another box. "Done," she said. We continued until the last page. Then she printed a summary and slid it across the desk to me. "This is the cancellation report," she said. Once you sign, all of these changes will take effect within one business day. Some may trigger immediate payment failures on the receiving end. I picked up the pen and looked at the paper for a moment before signing, not because I was unsure, but because I understood that once something is written and processed and filed, the conversation changes. I signed my name and handed the pen back to her. That was the procedural part. The emotional part, I knew, would come later. And it would sound very different from the conversation on that porch. The emotional part started that same afternoon, although at first it came through as a very practical problem. I was in the backyard trimming the rose bushes when my phone buzzed in my pocket. I finished cutting the branch I was holding before I checked it. I found that most news, good or bad, can wait the extra 30 seconds it takes to finish what you're doing. It was a text from Caroline. Margaret, a few of our payments are showing declined. Is there a problem with the bank? I read the message once, then set the phone on the patio table and went back to the roses. The air smelled like cut stems and cool soil, and somewhere a lawnmower was running 2 houses over. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary day. About 10 minutes later, another message came. Also, the kids' tuition portal says the account is past due. I think something must be wrong on your end. Can you call the bank and fix it? On my end. I remember looking at that sentence for a long moment, not because I didn't understand it, but because I realized how long that had been the assumption. If something was paid, it was normal. If something wasn't paid, something must be wrong on my end. An hour later, Daniel called. Mom, he said, his voice tight. Something's going on with the accounts. The mortgage draft didn't go through. The car payment bounced. Did the bank make a mistake? I wiped my hands on my gardening gloves and said, very calmly, No, Daniel, the bank didn't make a mistake. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. What do you mean? He asked. I said, I reviewed my accounts this morning and made some changes. I'm reorganizing my finances. From now on, I'm going to be living within my own income. Another pause. Mom, he said slowly, you know we rely on those payments being handled. I looked out at the yard, at the fence I had painted myself last spring, at the small garden I had planted with my own hands. Yes, I said. I know. That's why I wanted to talk to you in person, not on the phone. Why don't you come by tomorrow morning and we'll go over everything together? He didn't answer right away. Finally, he said, All right. I'll come by in the morning. After I hung up, I sat down at the patio table and looked at the cancellation report again. It was only a few pages, but it represented years of quiet decisions. Procedure first, conversation second. That order mattered more than I think anyone realized yet. Because once something is documented, once it's processed, once it's in the system, the conversation changes. It becomes less about feelings and more about facts. That night, I slept better than I expected to, not because the situation was resolved, but because for the first time in a long time, I knew exactly where I stood on paper. Daniel arrived the next morning earlier than I expected. I heard the gravel in the driveway before I saw him, that quick, uneven crunch that told me he hadn't taken the turn slowly. He didn't knock the way he normally did. He opened the door and stepped inside, like he had when he was younger. Like this house still worked the way it used to. Mom, he said, already tense. We need to talk. I know, I said. Sit down. Do you want coffee? I don't want coffee, he said. I want to understand why the bank says all the transfers have been cancelled. I brought the folder and the cancellation report to the table and placed them in front of him, neat and square. Paper helps in conversations like this. Paper keeps people from pretending they don't understand. Before we talk about feelings, I said, we're going to talk about numbers. He sat down and started looking through the pages. Mortgage support, utilities, insurance, tuition, software subscriptions, maintenance, travel deposits, line after line of outgoing transfers. I didn't realize it was this much, he said finally. That's part of the problem, I said. You didn't realize, and I didn't make you realize. He leaned back in the chair and ran his hands through his hair. Mom, he said, we built our life around the understanding that you were helping us. We made long-term decisions based on that. Yes, I said. You did. That means you can't just stop overnight, he said. There are commitments, contracts, appearances. People are expecting things from us. Appearances. I remember that word very clearly because it told me exactly where the pressure was coming from. Not survival, not food, not shelter. Appearances. I folded my hands on the table and said very quietly, Daniel, do you remember what Caroline said to me on your porch the other night? He didn't answer. She told me I should learn to live more modestly so that you two could build your future, I continued. I went home and looked at my finances, and I realized she was right. I should be living within my own means. So that's what I'm doing. He looked up at me then, really looked at me. That's not what she meant, he said. That's exactly what she meant, I replied. She just didn't expect the definition to apply to you. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. For a moment, he looked very young, like someone who had just discovered that the floor he was standing on was not as solid as he thought. I wish you had talked to me first, he said. I am talking to you, I said. Right now. And I'm showing you. I slid the cancellation report toward him again. These transfers were discretionary, I said. That means voluntary. They were not loans, and they were not obligations. The bank confirmed that yesterday. He looked at the report for a long time. So that's it? He asked. You're just done helping us? I thought about that question carefully before I answered. I'm done funding a lifestyle that requires me to live smaller so that you can live larger, I said. That doesn't mean I'm done being your mother. He didn't argue after that. He just sat there quietly, looking at the papers, like someone reading instructions for a machine he had been operating for years without knowing how it worked. After a long silence, he said something that told me exactly where his mind was. Caroline is going to be very upset, he said. This is going to be embarrassing. We have people coming next week. The car lease company already called. If the mortgage draft fails again, it's going to raise questions. Raise questions. I looked at him and said, Daniel, you're worried about questions. I'm worried about authorization forms with my name on them that I didn't sign. He froze. What authorization forms? He asked. I opened the folder and placed the printed document from the bank on the table between us. He picked it up and read it slowly. Halfway through the page, his face changed. Not angry, not defensive, just very still. She told me this was just paperwork in case something happened to you, he said quietly. She said it would make things easier later. I didn't know she had already taken it to the bank. I didn't say anything for a moment. Sometimes silence gives people room to hear themselves. Then I said, the bank flagged the signature. They didn't process it, but they documented the attempt. He stared at the paper for a long time. That's when everything changed, he said quietly. Yes, I said. For me, it did. And for the first time since he walked into the house that morning, he didn't look like he was trying to argue. He looked like he was trying to understand. After Daniel left that morning, the house felt very quiet again. Not empty, just quiet in a different way, like a conversation had finished and the walls were still holding onto the last few words. I made myself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table with the folder in front of me. I wasn't looking for anything new anymore. I was just organizing. Statements in one section. Authorization records in another. Property-related documents in a third. When things are in the right folders, problems start to look smaller and more manageable. Around noon, I went to the grocery store. Not because I needed much, but because ordinary errands help when life changes shape. The store was cool and smelt like oranges and floor cleaner. And the same cashier I'd seen for years asked me if I wanted paper or plastic like she always did. At the produce section, Mrs. Hanley from 2 streets over looked at me and said, "I saw a tow truck at your son's place this morning. Everything all right over there?" I picked up a bag of apples and placed them carefully into one of the thin plastic bags. "I think they're reorganizing a few things," I said. She nodded, in that slow way people do when they understand more than you actually said. "Well," she replied, "sometimes reorganizing is expensive." "Yes," I said, "sometimes it is." That was the social part of things. Not loud, not dramatic, but once financial structures change, the world notices in small ways. A different car in the driveway, fewer lights on at night, conversations that become quieter when certain names are mentioned. A few days later, the first official letter arrived at my house. Plain white envelope, window address, nothing handwritten. The kind of letter that looks unimportant until you open it. It was a notification from the mortgage servicing company, stating that a third-party payment source connected to Daniel and Caroline's property loan had been removed, and that future payments would need to be made directly by the primary account holders to avoid default status. In simple terms, it meant the bank had officially recorded that I was no longer part of that structure. I folded the letter neatly and placed it in a new folder. Not the old one, a new one. I labeled it in blue ink. Personal accounts, active control. I didn't feel angry when I wrote that. I felt organized. That was the best way I can describe that period of time. Not emotional, not dramatic, just organized. That afternoon, Daniel called again. His voice sounded different this time. Not sharp, not demanding, tired. "The mortgage company sent a letter," he said. "Yes," I said. "They would." "We're trying to refinance," he said quickly. "Just to move some things around and buy time." "That sounds like a reasonable plan," I said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The bank asked for income verification and debt ratios. It's tighter than we expected." "I imagine it is," I said. There was another pause. Then he said, "Caroline spoke to a lawyer. She thought that because you supported us for so many years, there might be some kind of obligation, like implied support." There it was, the word I had been expecting. Obligation. "I asked the bank about that," I said calmly. "They reviewed the account clause with me. The transfers were discretionary. That means voluntary. Voluntary support does not create legal dependency." He didn't answer right away. Finally, he said, "The lawyer said something similar this morning." That was the institutional part working quietly in the background. Not loud, not dramatic. Just rules, written long before any of us had this conversation, now being applied exactly as they were written. On Saturday morning, I went to the farmer's market to buy tomatoes and honey. It was busy, and people were talking about the weather and the price of eggs, and someone's grandson starting college in the fall. Normal conversations. I ran into Caroline's friend, Rebecca. She looked surprised to see me, then uncomfortable, then overly polite, all in about 3 seconds. "Margaret," she said, "how have you been?" "I've been well," I said. "How are you?" She adjusted the strap of her purse and said, a little too casually, "Caroline's been under a lot of stress lately. I think everything with the house and the cars and the kids' school, it's just a lot, all at once." I nodded. "Yes," I said. "It is a lot when bills arrive and no one is expecting them." She looked at me carefully then, like she was trying to decide whether I was being unkind or just honest. "I'm sure this is all just a misunderstanding that will get sorted out," she said. I picked up a jar of honey and turned it slowly in my hands, watching the light move through it. "I don't think it's a misunderstanding," I said. "I think it's an adjustment." She didn't know what to say to that, so she just nodded and said she hoped everyone would be all right. So did I. But I knew all right was going to look different from now on. A few days later, Daniel brought another letter to my house and placed it on the kitchen table. He didn't sit down right away. He just stood there, looking around like he was seeing the house differently. It was a notice from the leasing company. One of the cars had been repossessed due to missed payments. "I didn't realize how many things were connected to you," he said quietly. I poured 2 cups of tea and slid one toward him. "That was the problem," I said. "Too many things were connected to me, and almost none of the decisions were." He nodded slowly and sat down. "We're selling the second car," he said. "We cancelled the club membership. We're cutting a lot of things. Trips, subscriptions. The kids are switching to a different school next semester." That must have been a hard conversation. I could hear it in the way he said the words, like each one had been negotiated in a room where no one was happy. After a long silence, he said, "I used to think success meant everything getting easier every year." I stirred my tea and said, "Sometimes success is just finally knowing what things actually cost." He looked down at the table and nodded. And that was the point where the situation split into 2 different worlds. In my world, things were getting simpler. Fewer transfers, fewer open authorizations, clear accounts, clear responsibilities. In their world, things were getting more complicated. Meetings with the bank, meetings with a lawyer, budgets, refinancing, selling assets, explaining things to their children, explaining things to their friends. Same situation, 2 very different realities. And all of it had been created by one very simple change. I stopped signing things I wasn't in the room to discuss. About a week later, the tone shifted again. Not suddenly, and not dramatically. Just enough that you could hear it if you were paying attention. Daniel called in the early evening, around the time people are usually finishing dinner. His voice was steadier than before. Still tired, but no longer searching for something to push against. "We met with the bank again today," he said. "We're restructuring the loan. It's not going to be comfortable for a while, but it's workable." "I'm glad to hear that," I said. There was a short pause, then he added, "They went through everything with us: income, liabilities, obligations. The numbers are different when they're only ours." I leaned back in my chair and looked out the window at the backyard. The light was starting to soften, that early evening shift when everything looks a little calmer than it actually is. "That tends to happen," I said. He gave a quiet, almost embarrassed laugh. "The banker said something that stuck with me," he continued. He said, "Support is not the same thing as income." I think I built my life like it was. I didn't answer right away. I let that sentence sit there between us for a moment. "Most people don't understand the difference until they have to," I said. Another pause. "Caroline's adjusting," he said, though the way he said it suggested that adjusting was still in progress. "She's taking on more clients. We've cut a lot of expenses. The kids, they're noticing the changes. I imagined that. Fewer activities. Different routines. Conversations that don't quite get finished at the dinner table. That's part of learning," I said. "For all of you." He didn't argue with that. A few days later, he came by again. This time he knocked, and he waited. That small difference mattered more than anything he could have said. We sat in the living room, and for a while we didn't talk about money at all. We talked about the weather, about a neighbor who had repainted his fence the wrong color, about a recipe I had tried that didn't turn out the way I expected. Normal conversation. Then, after a while, he said, "I think I owe you an apology." I didn't interrupt him. "I got used to a life I didn't actually build," he continued. "And I let Caroline handle things I should have been paying attention to myself. When the payments stopped, I thought you were reacting emotionally. But after the bank meetings, the paperwork, the numbers, I realized you weren't reacting." He paused, then said, "You were just changing the structure." I almost smiled at that, but not quite. "I never wanted to hurt you," he added. I thought this was how families worked when one person had more." I folded my hands in my lap and said, "Families help each other." But help and dependency are not the same thing. He nodded slowly. We sold one of the cars, he said. We're renting out the guest room for a while. We cancelled the club membership. The kids are switching schools next semester. It's not easy, but it's real. Real. That was the right word. He looked at me then and said something that I think took him a long time to understand. I should have asked you what this was costing you, he said. I shook my head slightly. You should have asked me if I wanted to, I said. Not just if I could. He nodded, and we sat there quietly for a moment. The clock on the wall ticked, steady and ordinary. Before he left, he stood near the door and said, I always thought you were being quiet because you didn't mind. I didn't realize you were being quiet because you were paying attention. I watched him for a moment before answering. Silence isn't always agreement, I said. Sometimes it's just observation. After he left, I wrote that sentence down in my notebook, not because I needed records anymore, but because I didn't want to forget what it meant. Over the next couple of weeks, things continued to settle. There were still letters, but fewer of them. There were still calls, but they were shorter, more focused. The urgency faded and was replaced by routine. Payments scheduled, budgets adjusted, conversations that sounded less like reactions and more like planning. One evening, Daniel called and said, We made the mortgage payment on our own this month. There was a small pause after he said it, like he was waiting to see how it sounded out loud. That's good, I said. You should be proud of that. I think I am, he replied. After we hung up, I went into the kitchen and took out a small container of apple cake I had saved in the freezer. I let it thaw on the counter and then sat down at the table and ate it slowly. Not for anyone else, just for me. Because somewhere in the middle of all the letters, the phone calls, the bank meetings, and the quiet conversations, I realized something very simple. I had spent years supporting a life I wasn't allowed to sit at the table and enjoy. And once I understood that clearly, everything else became easier to decide. The final confirmation came in a thin envelope about 3 weeks later. By then, the house felt different. Not physically different, the same curtains, the same chairs, the same quiet hum of the refrigerator, but the air felt settled, like a decision had finished echoing. The envelope was from the bank. Inside was a simple confirmation letter stating that all third-party authorizations had been removed. The credit line had been locked to in-person authorization only, and the account protection note had been added to my file permanently. It was only one page, but it represented something much larger than paper. It meant the structure had changed. A few days after that, Daniel came by again. This time he knocked, and he waited for me to open the door. That small difference told me more than anything he could have said. We sat in the living room, and he looked around slowly, the way people do when they're trying to understand something familiar in a new way. I think I owe you an apology, he said. I didn't interrupt him. I got used to a life I didn't actually build, he continued. And I let Caroline handle things I should have been paying attention to myself. When the payments stopped, I wanted to believe you were just angry. But after the bank meetings, the refinancing paperwork, the budgets, I realized you weren't angry. He paused, then said, You were organized. I almost smiled at that, but not quite. I never wanted to hurt you, he said. I thought this was how families worked when one person had more. I folded my hands in my lap and said, Families help each other. But help and dependency are not the same thing. He nodded slowly. We sold one of the cars, he said. We cancelled the club membership. We're renting out the guest room for a while. The kids are adjusting to the new school. It's not easy, but it's real. Real. That was the word he kept coming back to. After a moment, he said, I should have asked you what this was costing you. I shook my head slightly. You should have asked me if I wanted to, I said. not just if I could. He nodded, and we sat there quietly for a minute. The clock on the wall ticked, steady and ordinary. Before he left, he stood in the doorway and said, "I always thought you were being quiet because you didn't mind. I didn't realize you were being quiet because you were watching." After he left, I wrote that sentence down in my notebook, not because I needed records anymore, but because I didn't want to forget the lesson in it. Some people mistake silence for permission, but silence is often just observation. A few weeks later, life became very normal again. I went to the grocery store, I watered the garden, I paid my own bills, I met a friend for lunch. Ordinary life, but this time it was fully mine. One evening, Daniel called and said, "We made the mortgage payment on our own this month." There was a small pride in his voice, the kind you hear when someone has done something difficult without help for the first time. "That's good," I said. "You should be proud of that." "I think I am," he said. After we hung up, I sat on the back porch and watched the sun go down behind the fence. The air smelled like cut grass, and somewhere a dog barked twice and then stopped. I thought about everything that had happened over those weeks: the dinner, the porch, the bank office, the letters, the phone calls, the quiet conversations. And I realized the most important thing that changed wasn't the money, it was the structure. Authority doesn't come from saying something first. It comes from knowing what you're allowed to change and then changing it. I never raised my voice. I never made a scene. I never tried to embarrass anyone or prove a point in public. I just read the documents, asked the right questions, signed the right forms, and let procedure do what procedure is designed to do. And in the end, everything returned to something very simple and very fair. They lived on their income. I lived on mine. And the relationship we had after that was smaller, but it was also more honest. If stories about quiet boundaries resonate with you, you're welcome to stay. Because sometimes the most important changes in life don't happen when someone shouts. They happen when someone sits down, opens a folder, and finally decides to read what's actually written there.